Today's gospel reading can feel rather dramatic or jarring. You can feel family tensions in the background with the brother who wants Jesus to sort out their dispute on family inheritance. It's easy to imagine this person coming to Jesus after having many arguments with their family. It's possible that they have their own financial struggles. I imagine them coming to Jesus just wanting a solution. There's all this tension, and Jesus responds with a rather harsh parable of the rich fool. The rich fool has put all this time and effort into acquiring wealth and finding some way to keep it. Years of hard work, making various sacrifices along the way. And by all outwards appearances, they are very successful. But then God tells them that none of that success matters because in death, they won't take any of it with them. Well, that's disappointing. And this is a story that is supposed to bring comfort to someone who is stressed out over money and family. Well, there is some comfort in it. Initially, the parable looks like it could be summed up by the expression, "You only live once." However, I think that although the core theme is living life to its fullest, there are more nuances to it. The first nuance is regarding the hoarding of wealth. Although the main character of the story, although the main character of the parable hoards wealth, there are other elements of his life that are mentioned. The wealthy landowner had his existing barns torn down and bigger, newer ones built. That would have involved large amounts of time and work. And if he's wealthy, it probably would have involved hiring other people in the community. I can see his ambitions. I can see him trying to make things better. And I imagine that most of us have parts of our lives that are kind of like this rich man's possessions. For some, it is money. They feel the need to earn more, to be of more value. For some people, it's material possessions. They want a nicer car, and then another car that's nicer than the first. For some, it's accomplishment. They need to keep achieving more, and they need to impress more and more people. Perhaps I should use the word we instead of they, because I consider myself part of this group. Along with trying to acquire something, this parable could also be looking at the effort to prevent something. Storing food is one way to prevent starvation or to prevent poverty. And I think these are impulses that we can relate to. But what happens when you hyper-focus on these aspects of life? Other parts get sacrificed. When money is hoarded, it isn't being used to help anyone, including the community. When time is spent on building new barns, it isn't spent on relationships with others. The very thing that makes the fool rich, the very thing that makes him successful, also becomes his weakness that separates him from others. An example that comes to mind recently was from a movie I saw last weekend. I went out to see the Elvis movie by Baz Luhrmann. I wonder if any of you have seen it or are just familiar with the story of Elvis in general. This movie tells the story of him being discovered by a man who would eventually become his manager, and it ends shortly before his death. It shows that Elvis grew up in a family that suffered from poverty, and it shows him having a deep love for his family and a deep desire to provide for them. And this desire motivates him to make a number of decisions early on in his career, decisions that have lasting consequences. Elvis placed a lot of trust in Parker, his manager. And although Elvis' career blossomed under Parker, and although Parker did help him take care of his family, there was also a great cost in that Parker eventually had Elvis on a performing schedule in Las Vegas that was so intense It kept him away from his family, to the point where his wife and daughter ended up leaving him. Elvis had achieved all this fame and wealth to provide for a family, but in the end, all this effort ended up separating him from them. This is a pretty exaggerated example of how one's greatest strength can also be a little destructive at times. But I think we can relate to the experience where we've put large amounts of effort, of time, of talent, and treasure into an endeavor, only to discover that the thing we were fighting for mattered a little less than we thought. With all these pressures, I can understand the impulse to build new barns. And I'm all for maintaining the existing barns, by all means. Fix the roof so the grain stays dry. Fix the doors and walls to keep out the mice. But remember, despite all that effort, sometimes the barn breaks. What I'd like to think about for this next part involves a bit of reading between the lines. I'm assuming that the new barns involved labor from the surrounding community. At least I'm imagining my father's stories of old-fashioned barn raisings where communities would get together to build the new barns. Anyways, I'm thinking that these new barns suggest that this man lived among a community that would work with him. What I would like to think is that if one of his original barns had burnt down or broke, or if his crops failed, the community would have supported him. And it's that gift of community support that I think gets lost with this man's effort to store up all his wealth. And it's this gift of community support that I've seen here. Yesterday, there was an altercation at the breakfast program, and someone was injured. But what I would like to point out was that the support mechanisms that jumped into actions were incredible. People were right there to see that he received medical attention. People were there to comfort the other guests. And afterwards, staff and volunteers got together to support each other. I wish stuff like these negative incidents didn't happen, but I am very glad and very proud to be part of a community that practices such care. I believe that it is a community that does the maintenance on the barn, and a community that gives generously from the grain stores. So I'd like to just say thanks be to God for the different gifts that hold the barn together, and thank you to all of you for generously giving of your time and talent.